All right, so let's dive into this whole Waterloo situation. What's going on with the city's leadership? And honestly, the stuff you sent me, articles, reports, public statements, it's kind of worrisome.
It paints a a pretty concerning picture,
Yeah, we're talking about abuse of power, broken promises, and from what I'm seeing, a lot of frustrated residents.
A lot of, yeah.
So is there fire behind all this smoke?
That's what we're here to find out.
Let's try to figure it out.
You know what really jumps out at me? It's this contrast. The high hopes when Stan Darter was elected.
Yeah.
And just the wave of disappointment that's come crashing down just over a year later.
Oh, yeah.
Remember, he campaigned on transparency, better communication, community engagement,
Yeah.
fresh air, or so we thought.
Yeah, that honeymoon phase.
It seems to be over.
It's definitely over.
The sources you sent describe a real growing distrust in City Hall,
Mhm.
this sense that Darter's gone silent on key issues, and even some straight-up allegations of mismanagement.
Yeah, that's a big deal.
Yeah, and one of the things that I find most concerning is is his communication style, or maybe lack thereof.
Mhm.
Multiple sources described him as incredibly difficult to reach, prefers written communication over actually meeting with people.
Hmm.
And I mean, on the surface, that might not seem like a big deal, but
It does create a barrier, though, doesn't it? Especially with those complex issues where dialogue is essential.
exactly.
Back and forth.
How do you hash things out over email?
Right.
It just raises this question. Is this just a quirky leadership style? Or is it a calculated way to avoid accountability?
Right.
And the sources I've seen seem to lean toward the latter, especially when you look at the controversies brewing in the building and zoning department.
Okay, let's talk about that. What is going on there?
Well, multiple businesses have come forward with complaints about delays, denials of permits, just this wildly inconsistent enforcement of the rules.
Mhm.
Some businesses are hitting roadblock after roadblock. Others are getting preferential treatment.
And this is where Nathan Kriebel comes into the picture, right?
Mm-hmm.
He's the building official and code administrator for the city. So just for our listeners, the building official, they hold a lot of power.
A lot of power.
They're responsible for enforcing building codes, issuing permits, making sure construction projects are safe, up to code.
Right. And the allegations against Kriebel are pretty serious. We're not just talking about, messing up paperwork.
Right.
These sources suggest abuse of power, favoritism, and even actions that could have legal ramifications.
Okay, wow. When you say actions, what kind of actions are we talking about?
Well, for starters, there are claims that Kriebel may have used his position to influence local elections. Some residents allege that he pressured his tenants to vote for specific candidates, including Darter.
Hold on. A city official potentially swaying an election. That's incredibly troubling. And there's more, right? You mentioned potential legal issues.
Yeah, there are multiple reports of Kriebel entering private property without warrants or permission, including one very specific incident in Fultz, Illinois, where a resident filed a police report for criminal trespass.
Oh, wow.
The Monroe County Sheriff's Department report actually states that Kriebel was allegedly caught peering into windows and recording video footage on that property.
That's a major invasion of privacy.
Yeah.
And it just goes against any idea of due process or respect for property rights.
Exactly.
So you have these allegations.
Yeah, and then you combine those with these inconsistent permit approvals, it really starts to raise questions about his judgment.
Yeah.
And whether he's fit to hold such a powerful position.
Right, and we have Darter, who's avoiding face-to-face communication,
Mm-hmm.
potentially fostering a culture of unaccountability.
Hmm.
And then we have Kriebel, the person who's supposed to be upholding the city's building codes, allegedly abusing his power, acting with impunity. It's a pretty bleak picture so far.
And honestly, this might just be the tip of the iceberg. As we go deeper into this, we need to ask ourselves, are these isolated incidents? Or are they symptomatic of a larger pattern of misconduct and disregard for the rule of law in Waterloo?
It's a great question, and one that we're going to explore further. But before we do, I want to remind our listeners that we are eager to hear your experiences, your perspectives on the situation in Waterloo. If you have insights, stories, even gut feelings you want to share, email us. contact@monroecountytruth.com.
Your voices are crucial in helping us piece together the full picture of what's happening in Waterloo. Now let's get back to those inconsistent permit approvals. What's really fascinating is one of those permits with missing documentation, the one for 117 N Main Street, involves a property owned by a sitting city alderman, a sports bar.
Okay.
It raises some serious questions about favoritism and whether certain individuals are receiving special treatment from City Hall.
Yeah, that's a huge red flag. It adds weight to this idea
Yeah.
that there are two sets of rules in Waterloo, one for the connected and one for everybody else.
Exactly. And this lack of transparency and this potential for preferential treatment, it goes beyond building permits.
Yeah.
Let's not forget Darter's campaign promised to advocate for city workers.
Right.
I think it's worth examining how that promise played out, particularly when it comes to the water plant outsourcing situation.
Right, because that was a big deal. You have Darter promising to support city employees, and then, boom, one of his first major moves is to outsource the city's water plant operations to a private company called Surtop.
What happened there?
What happened? Well, according to the sources, city employees and the union representing those workers, they vehemently opposed the outsourcing deal. They argued that they could operate the water plant more efficiently and at a lower cost to taxpayers. They even presented Darter with a proposal that would have kept the jobs local while saving money. Okay, so they gave him a viable alternative. Why would he ignore their concerns and go ahead with this outsourcing deal? Who benefits from that?
Right. That's the million-dollar question. The financial logic behind outsourcing the water plant is murky at best.
Yeah.
Some sources suggest that the Surtop deal was actually more expensive than the union's proposal.
So it wasn't about saving money or increasing efficiency. Seems like something else is at play here. Could this be another example of Darter favoring certain interests over the needs of the community and his own employees?
It definitely raises those questions. And when you consider this alongside his lack of communication and Crable's alleged misconduct, it starts to form a very troubling pattern.
Yeah, it's like this domino effect. Each new piece of information just reinforces this growing sense that there's this lack of accountability and transparency at the heart of Waterloo's city government.
Exactly. And this lack of accountability has this corrosive effect on the entire community. It breeds cynicism, erodes trust in institutions, and it discourages people from engaging in civic life.
Which is incredibly dangerous for a democracy. If people don't believe that their voices matter or that their government is working for them, they're less likely to participate. It's just a vicious cycle.
Of apathy and disillusionment.
Exactly.
That's why it's so crucial for citizens to speak out, to demand answers, and to hold those in power accountable.
Absolutely. And that brings us to another piece of this puzzle, the Toxic Vibes article. That was published about the previous administration, led by Mayor Tom Smith.
Right. That article that painted this pretty scathing picture of Smith's leadership, alleging a hostile work environment at City Hall. But the timing of that article, just weeks before the election, it was pretty curious.
It does seem awfully convenient for Darter, almost like a well-timed smear campaign to discredit his opponent.
Yeah, the timing certainly raises questions. And when you look at the substance of the article, you find that a lot of these allegations are based on anonymous sources or disgruntled former employees. One individual, Robin Hanner, she resigned over a year before the article was published and made some pretty vague claims about a toxic environment. But there's no record of her or anyone else formally complaining during Smith's tenure.
Okay, so no paper trail, no concrete evidence, just these vague allegations conveniently surfacing right before the election. It makes you wonder about the motivations behind the article. Was this meant to manipulate public opinion rather than expose any real wrongdoing?
Exactly. And it's worth noting that under Smith's leadership, Waterloo saw some pretty significant progress in terms of economic development and infrastructure improvements. He actually had this reputation for being accessible and responsive to the community. So this sudden emergence of these toxic vibes allegations, without any prior complaints or evidence, it does seem suspicious.
It's almost like they were trying to create this narrative of Smith being this terrible leader to make Darter look like the savior, the knight in shining armor who would come in and fix everything.
Right. That's a very astute observation. It's a classic political tactic. Tear down your opponent to build yourself up. And sadly, it seems to have worked in this case.
Yeah. It's a reminder of how important it is to be critical consumers of information, especially during election season. We need to look beyond the headlines and sound bites, really examine the evidence, consider the sources, and ask ourselves who benefits from this narrative.
Absolutely. Before we dive further into the potential political maneuvering at play here, I think it's essential to hear from the people most affected by these controversies, the residents of Waterloo.
Yes, because ultimately this isn't just some abstract political drama. These issues have real-world consequences for the people who live and work in this community. So to our listeners out there, we want to hear from you.
What are your experiences with the city of Waterloo? Have you encountered similar issues with permits, zoning, or dealing with city officials?
Share your stories, insights, frustrations with us. You can email us at contact@monroecountytruth.com. We'll be reading your messages and incorporating your voices into the next part of our deep dive.
Now, getting back to the Toxic Vibes article, it's important to remember that those allegations of a toxic work environment under Mayor Smith were never substantiated.
Right.
There were no formal complaints filed, no investigations launched, and no evidence presented beyond these claims from a few disgruntled individuals.
It makes you wonder, was the article a legitimate attempt to expose wrongdoing? Or was it a calculated political hit job to sway the election in Darter's favor?
It's tough to say for sure, but the timing and the lack of concrete evidence certainly make it seem suspicious.
Yeah, and it's not just the Toxic Vibes article. There's this broader pattern here of Darter and his allies using these questionable tactics to consolidate power and silence dissent. Remember how Darter prefers written communication over actually meeting with people?
Right, that aversion to direct dialogue. It could be seen as a way to control the narrative, to avoid being challenged, to create a paper trail that protects him from accountability.
It's like he wants to operate in the shadows, where it's harder to scrutinize his actions and hold him responsible for his decisions. And speaking of scrutiny, let's dive into those emails we got from our listeners. We asked you to share your experiences with the city of Waterloo, and we got some really insightful responses.
These firsthand accounts are so valuable. They give us a glimpse into how these controversies are impacting the lives of everyday people.
Absolutely. One email that really stood out to me came from a small business owner who went through absolute hell trying to get permits for renovations. They described these endless delays, conflicting information from city officials, and just this general sense that the rules were being applied arbitrarily.
That echoes what we've heard from other sources as well. It seems like the permitting process in Waterloo is just a bureaucratic nightmare, and there's a real lack of transparency and consistency in how those regulations are enforced.
Yeah, and this business owner mentioned feeling pressured to support certain candidates during the last election, which aligns with those allegations of Krebel using his position to influence voters.
Right. It creates a chilling effect when people feel like they have to choose between speaking out and jeopardizing their livelihoods.
Absolutely. It undermines the very foundation of a fair and democratic society.
Yeah.
Another email we received came from a longtime resident of Waterloo who expressed deep disappointment in Darter's leadership. They voted for him based on his promises of transparency and change, but they feel like he's betrayed the trust of the community.
Yeah.
He specifically mentioned the water plant outsourcing as a prime example of Darter putting special interests ahead of the needs of his constituents and city workers.
And that sentiment seems to be shared by many in Waterloo. There's this sense that Darter has become disconnected from the people he represents and is more concerned with consolidating power than serving the community.
We also heard from a former city employee who worked under both Mayor Smith and Mayor Darter. And they said that while there were certainly challenges under Smith, they never experienced anything that can be described as a toxic work environment. They actually felt valued and respected during Smith's tenure. But under Darter, they described a much more tense and fearful atmosphere, where employees felt pressured to conform and avoid rocking the boat.
It really makes you question the veracity of those toxic vibes allegations and whether they were part of a deliberate smear campaign to damage Smith's reputation and boost Darter's chances of winning the election?
Right. It's a reminder that we can't always take things at face value, especially when it comes to politics. We need to be critical thinkers, we need to examine the evidence, and we need to consider the motivations of those who are shaping the narrative.
And that's where citizen journalism and independent media outlets like ours play such a vital role. We need to dig deeper, ask tough questions, and hold those in power accountable.
Absolutely. Sunlight is the best disinfectant. By shining a light on these controversies, by amplifying the voices of those who've been marginalized or silenced, we can help create a more transparent and accountable government. And that's what this deep dive has been all about. We've uncovered some disturbing information about potential abuse of power, broken promises, and this lack of transparency in Waterloo. But it's not enough to just expose these issues. We need to demand better from our leaders.
We need to hold them accountable for their actions, and we need to create a system where the voices of the people are heard and their needs are prioritized.
So to our listeners out there, we urge you to stay engaged, stay informed, and stay active in your community. Don't be afraid to speak out, ask questions, and demand better from those who represent you.
The future of Waterloo depends on the active participation of its citizens.
And remember, if you have any personal experiences or insights related to the city of Waterloo, we want to hear from you. You can email us at contact@monroecountytruth.com. Your voices matter.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, stay curious, stay skeptical, and stay engaged.